Okay, everyone, welcome back. Welcome back for panel 2 of the Convergence Undergraduate Colloquium here, Literature Undergraduates Colloquium here at Concordia. Panel 2, Reframing the Past. Thank you everyone joining us on Zoom, joining us on YouTube. We are streaming to YouTube live from ForeSpace. We are located in unceded indigenous lands. Just wanted to mention, everyone on Zoom, we welcome comments, questions there via the chat. Those of you in the space, as you probably know by now, will get a microphone to you during the Q&A. All right, with my pleasure to hand it over once again to introduce panel 2, Louise Vanu. Louise.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. So our second panel, Reframing the Past, will be looking at ways that literature can intersect with history. And our guest speaker will be Concordia's Professor Shannon McSheffrey, who is Professor of History, expert in late medieval England between Black Death and mid-16th century. And Professor McSheffrey has written extensively and also engages with online history and blogs, and yeah, so she does a lot. And yeah, she was also elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society of the UK in 2002. And I am very pleased and grateful that she will be our guest speaker for this panel, and I'll hand it over to her. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Louise. I'm very pleased to be chairing this panel. We're going to hear 3 really interesting papers. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers just before they present their papers, and then we will hold all of the questions until the end, as you probably know. So our first speaker is Teomi of Avila Baker. She is a 4th-year Concordia student studying creative writing and liberal arts. Her literary interests include experimental short fiction and anything written by Heather O'Neill. Previously, she's been published in Corpus Journal, Soliloquies Anthology, and Pixie Literary Magazine. So, Teomi.
Thank you. So my essay is titled Disenchantment of the Endless Quest for Fiction in Cervantes' Don Quixote. So, Cervantes' 17th century novel, The Ingenious Don Quixote de la Mancha, employs tools to I'm not the best at reading, so bear with me. Tools to construct structural and narrative complexity which blur the line between fiction and reality to both comedic and tragic ends. The spirit of endless adventure and pseudo-historic style popular at the time characterized the first part of the novel and largely influenced the second as a result of Alonso Fernández de Avellaneda's publication of an apocryphal sequel. Cervantes' overwhelmingly disdainful tone towards fiction and fantasy in the second part of the novel reveals Cervantes and Don Quixote's increasingly parallel disenchantment. Thus, the evolution of truth, fiction, and history, as well as the coalescence of character and author across both parts of Cervantes' Don Quixote, explore the extent to which stories and the context in which they emerge from can transform the material lives of those they touch, ultimately leading to Don Quixote's madness, disenchantment, and demise. Before the story of Don Quixote begins, readers are introduced to the idea that, throughout the novel, truth will be subordinated to or transformed into fiction. The majority of the prologue, for example, features a friend of Cervantes who essentially tells Cervantes to invent classic works of literature to reference in his novel, introducing the possibility that Don Quixote is not entirely grounded in truth or reality. In fact, Cervantes' friend is never identified nor given a place of work or home, and is thus plausible that Cervantes invents him to serve the narrative function of setting the stage for an ill-defined boundary between what is true and what is fictitious. Readers now question the reliability of the narrative voice, as it has been introduced as possibly toying with the truth of the story. In fact, Don Quixote's scribe, Cid Hammadi, alludes to this skewing of truth in his transcriptions as well. The scribe writes that some of the details he includes in his transcriptions, such as the spelling of Quixote, do not need to be perfectly accurate to ensure the quality of the tale, provided that the narrator doesn't stray 1 inch from the truth. This paradoxical statement acknowledges the importance of some truth to remain factual, but also allows for a margin of inaccuracy, suggesting that some facts in the narrative are truthful while others are less so. Furthermore, a basis for how to distinguish between the truthful facts and the untruthful ones is not provided. Hence, Cervantes warns his readers of the trouble they will have distinguishing truth from fiction when reading Don Quixote, just as the protagonist, Don Quixote, will not be able to distinguish truth from fiction when reading chivalric romances. Don Quixote misinterprets the found document style of chivalric tales, a stylistic staple of the genre, as factual histories, which eventually drives him mad. Once this idea takes hold, it becomes so established in Quixote's mind that no history in the world was truer for him. Rather than interpreting truth as objective fact, Quixote's reality is subjective, molded by his interpretation and subsequent embodiment of chivalric romances. This transforms his personal beliefs, attitudes, and experiences into a delusional reality, which renders him incapable of distinguishing truth from fiction. Dano notes that if one wants truth, one must forego fiction, and if one prefers fiction, one must not take it literally. Don Quixote nonetheless denies the fact that fiction is a constructed and allegorical representation of truth. Throughout Part 1, Don Quixote's subjective truth consistently displaces objective reality in favor of a new reality he constructs using the logic of fiction, which presents the world through a fantastical yet inaccurate lens. The transformative power of these chivalric romances affects Don Quixote's reality to the point of delusion. Fiction strongly influences Quixote's world in the initial chapters of the novel, as the fictional world of knight-errantry taints and distorts his own. In Chapter 2 of Part 1, Don Quixote mistakes an inn for a castle, the innkeeper for a lord, and prostitutes for princesses. The inn scenes thus serves as a stage for a dramatized debate between history and fiction played out for the reader. On one hand, Don Quixote is consumed in his endless quest for fiction, for the invention and discovery of multiple adventures, akin to those portrayed in chivalric romances. On the other hand, the innkeeper and prostitutes are not led astray by this same spell of fiction, and live instead in objective reality. The notion that Quixote's truth does not reflect reality, but instead an obsession with fiction, leads other characters to attribute the cause of his madness to fiction. The narrative voice, a scribe character, transcribing and narrating Quixote's tales, occupies a position which grants him the authority to reinforce the distinction between reality and fiction. For example, the scribe clarifies that the inn is not a castle, the prostitutes are not princesses, thus assuring readers that Quixote is not an aspiring knight-errant on a noble quest, but a man of unsound mind on a strange adventure. Once again, Don Quixote's madness is attributed to fiction, as his interpretation of chivalric stories as truth transforms how he sees the world around him. But what makes Don Quixote cling so hard to fiction? What about chivalric romances drives him mad? Why do other characters not seem to embrace fiction in the way Don Quixote does? Different characters' interpretations of chivalric romances reveal a variety of potential relationships between truth and fiction. After witnessing how these romances corrupt Quixote and drive him mad, his niece and housekeeper condemn chivalric romances as unchristian, declaring that they should be burned like heretics to prevent them from harming others. The women perceive the transformative power of fiction to be a threat, capable of sullying and distorting their objective reality as it has Quixote's. Quixote himself, however, is already ensnared by his delusion and cannot comprehend nor recognize the threat he supposedly faces. Alternatively to both the women and Don Quixote, a priest present at the burning advocates to save some of the books. The way the priest engages with fiction, in particular chivalric romances, reflects literary historian Ruth L. Safar's analysis of how characters in Don Quixote respond to fiction and stories. She posits that certain characters, such as the priest, admire the structural quality of chivalric narratives and value them on account of their unique artistry and entertainment value. Others, however, respond to fiction through a form of suspension in which they temporarily lose themselves in the story and allow themselves to be moved forward within fictional limits. While the priest falls into the former category, Don Quixote falls into the latter, although to an excessive degree. He embodies this excessive suspension after reading and taking inspiration from an author who ends a chivalric romance with that promise of endless adventure. Subsequently, he devotes himself completely to the life of knight-errantry and chivalric adventures, aspiring to the author's same end. While certain characters surrounding Quixote appreciate chivalric romances aesthetically, none remain as suspended in the tale as he does. They do not or cannot conflate fiction with truth or reality. Quixote, however, is so absorbed in the fiction of his reality that he cannot disentangle the two, but can only entrench himself further into madness. Don Quixote's conflation of fiction with truth prompts a major shift tone in Part 2 that finds its roots outside the narrative in the publication of an apocryphal sequel, which colors Cervantes' approach to Part 2. Indeed, Chapter 8 of Part 1 ends with the statement that we await Don Quixote's third sally, followed by a Latin phrase which translates to, perhaps another will sing with a better plectrum. The ambiguity of these statements not only suggests the possibility of Cervantes writing a sequel, but also implies an open invitation for other authors to fill in the gaps in Don Quixote's adventures. Shortly after the publication of Don Quixote, an author known by the pseudonym Alfonso Fernández de Avellaneda publishes an apocryphal sequel that gained popularity and was eventually believed to be the official sequel. Avellaneda's plagiarism threatened Cervantes' legitimacy as author and prompted Cervantes to publish an official sequel over a decade after the publication of Part 1. After the sacrifice of his reliability as an author for the sake of the story in Part 1, Cervantes' sequel carries bitter and disdainful overtones that engage with the feeling of being taken advantage of. Part 2 is Cervantes' attempt to reclaim his story and reestablish his authority as the legitimate author of Don Quixote. The prologue to Part 2 ends with the statement that too much of a good thing causes it to be less valued, and a scarcity, even of a bad thing. Sorry, I'm going to restart that quote. Too much of a good thing causes it to be valued less, and a scarcity, even of a bad thing, confers a certain value of its own. In other words, Cervantes reveals his main qualm with the publication of the sequel. The overproduction of Don Quixote's stories causes them to become commonplace and disposable. When referring to the end of Part 1, Cervantes writes that the last chapter's excellence is only rivaled by its authenticity, further upholding the quality and legitimacy of the original Don Quixote. Thus, Cervantes' publication of a legitimate sequel works to reinstate the authenticity of both narrative and author, while demeaning not only the author of the apocryphal sequel, but also the popularity it garners. Within this context, Cervantes' narrative and tonal shifts towards bitterness and disillusionment blur the distinction between author and character, namely between Cervantes and Quixote, who become intrinsically linked. By overlapping the roles of character and author in Part 2, Cervantes draws a narrative parallel between Don Quixote and himself, through which he projects his own fear of misrepresentation onto Quixote's. While Cervantes' disillusionment stems from the appropriation of his work and undermining of his integrity as author, Don Quixote's is sparked by the fear of not being believed. Elsifar argues that all the characters of any importance are authors as well, pointing to the way in which characters in Part 2 are actively engaged in the authorship of their own stories. Namely, Cervantes uses his characters as a means to correct narrative inconsistencies in Part 1. For example, when Don Quixote is made aware of plot holes in Part 1, he and Sancho fill in the blanks through dialogue, thus engaging narratively as authors of their own lives while offering Cervantes an avenue to bolster his narrative reliability. This tactic parallels the moment in which Quixote's scribe is revealed to be a Moor, alluding to the stereotype that Arabs are untruthful. Not only does this jeopardize the scribe's reliability as a historian, but it also renders the reality of Don Quixote's adventures unreliable, thus relegating them to a plane of fiction. Both author and protagonist navigate the fear of misrepresentation narratively, which more broadly recalls and reinforces the persistent tension in Part 2 between truth and fiction, history, and fantasy. Thus, a fissure within Don Quixote's subjective reality begins to appear as he becomes unable to reconcile the poetic ideal of knight-errantry and the less glamorous realities of his life experiences, one that marks the onset of his disillusionment. Having placed so much trust in the truth of chivalric romance, the possibility that Don Quixote's own adventures could be unreliable demonstrates the power his story has to transform his initial enchantment into subsequent disillusionment. A new dissatisfaction emerges between Don Quixote and his romanticized quest for fiction as it begins to lose its charm. Descending further into dejection, Don Quixote does not embark on fantastical adventures of knighthood with the same fervor he does in Part 1. For example, in Part 2, Chapter 10, Sancho, upon recalling Don Quixote's habit of taking one thing for another, convinces Quixote that a peasant girl is Dulcinea, the Don's love interest. While Don Quixote falls for this ploy, instead of a princess, he only sees a peasant girl and asks why the enchanter deprives him of seeing Dulcinea's beauty, lamenting that he is the most unfortunate of men. The enchanter's tricks no longer serve to prompt his courage as they do in Part 1, but rather discourage him from his adventures. Don Quixote's habit of taking one thing for another fades as he calls an inn, because that's what Don Quixote calls it, contrary to his habit of calling all inns castles. The loss of this quirk is considerable, for it symbolizes Don Quixote's dedication to his subjective truth. Don Quixote reverses his previous behavior and now allows the world to control his actions instead of projecting his subjective truth onto it. This indicates an end to his indulgence in fantasy, the threat of his own story misrepresenting him, having transformed and guided him away from fictional adventure. In the last chapter of the novel, Don Quixote falls ill and has a revelation that prompts him to renounce chivalric life, revealing the extent to which Avellaneda's sequel has destroyed him, not only within the throes of fantasy, but insanity as well. The doctor articulates that depression and despondency resulting from his disenchantment are killing him. This diagnosis further reinforces the damaging potential of misrepresentation as it irrevocably harms Don Quixote's relationship to fiction. Quixote's truth, that he is a knight-errant, is disgraced by supposed misrepresentation of his adventures and of himself. Unable to rely on fiction to construct his reality, his obsessive relationship to fiction is destroyed. On his deathbed, he is suddenly struck by a revelation from God. My mind has been restored to me. He acknowledges how his obsessive reading of books of chivalry had cast gloomy shadows of ignorance over him. He is now aware of how fiction has corrupted his mind and abominates them all, condemning fiction on account of the danger it poses to impressionable minds. Don Quixote thus embodies a contradiction through the complete reversal of his character from one who initially claims that chivalry is a religion, but on the brink of death regrets having given Avellaneda an excuse for writing a sequel. Quixote, once captivated by the transformative influence of stories, loses his infatuation with fiction when he realizes that they distort his reality. As the end of Don Quixote's life coincides with the end of the novel, the transformative quality of stories becomes a catalyst for both. His excessive love for fiction leads to his disillusionment with reality, ultimately contributing to his demise. In many ways, Cervantes' Don Quixote is a lesson in reading. Immersed in the pseudo-historic world of chivalry, readers are met with ill-defined boundaries between truth, fiction, and history. To defend his subjective truth against other characters' objective reality, Don Quixote devotes himself to an endless quest for fiction. The tonal shift in Part 2 emerges from Cervantes' desire to reclaim his narrative authority after the publication of an apocryphal sequel. This shift, characterized by tonal and narrative shifts, intertwines Cervantes and Don Quixote's stories by blurring the distinction between author and character. Their mutual fear of being misrepresented is sparked by the transformative power of stories, have both within and beyond the bounds of fiction. Don Quixote's death is symbolic of how, without fiction, the character and the novel itself must come to an end.
Thanks very much, Teomi. That was really an interesting meditation on the distinctions between fiction and nonfiction and truth and, anyway, so we will get back to that. Our second speaker this afternoon is Maia R. Becerra. They are a Montreal-based Mexican poet and writer currently studying English and creative writing here at Concordia. Their work has been featured in various art zines and small publications, as well as local newspapers in their hometown of Puebla. Their writing explores themes relating to religion, the body, and the macabre. Maia is currently a poetry editor for Soliloquies Anthology. Maia.
Thank you. This essay is called Bluebeard and the Bloody Chamber, Curiosity as Virtue. Charles Perrault's Bluebeard was the first recorded version of the oral tale under the same name, which explored the consequences of curiosity within the context of marriage. Historically, the tale of Bluebeard has undergone various alterations, but the essence of the narrative remains the same. An innocent young woman marries a wealthy yet mysterious man who hides a secret in plain sight. The heroine is then tempted by curiosity to find the horrors that he hides, the corpses of his former wives, in a bloody chamber within his castle. The tale of Bluebeard has predominantly been presented as a warning against curiosity, particularly female curiosity, which is presented as an inherent trait or flaw in the unnamed protagonists across versions. Yet the notion of curiosity in this tale is often reduced to the succumbing of temptation, heavily alluding to the story of Eve in Genesis concerning the original sin. However, the notion of curiosity as a negative trait is merely one of the multiple interpretations of the tale. If understood through a Christian perspective, the search for knowledge is inherently frowned upon. But in Bluebeard, it is that very curiosity that saves the heroine and ends Bluebeard's murders. In this essay, I seek to contest the literary interpretation of Bluebeard as a moralistic warning against curiosity, and instead highlight the importance of transgression in the search for knowledge, as depicted by the end of both narrations. To do so, I will draw comparisons between Perrault's original Bluebeard and Angela Carter's adaptation of the story, The Bloody Chamber. Perrault's version of Bluebeard has been understood as the canonical written version of the fairy tale. According to Maria Tatar in the preface of the classic fairy tales, literary critics have framed the story as one of transgressive desire that warns against the consequences of curiosity and disobedience, thus prompting a reductionist view with regards to the female protagonist. In various versions across history, Bluebeard's wife has been presented as a naive but ultimately cunning woman, and she has also been vilified by the mark of blood. The element of blood proves to be one of the most important motifs across versions, where the key used to open the bloody chamber becomes perpetually stained, marking the protagonist with sin. While I will elaborate on the importance of the key later on, I want to highlight the theme of blood and the marking of the body of a once innocent woman or girl, and the subsequent transformation of her character by knowledge and the loss of innocence or virginity. The blood-stained key points towards the indelible nature of her transgression. She has become corrupted by knowledge. Looking into the Christian tradition through a biblical lens, the violation of a prohibition established by a figure of absolute authority, God, or in the case of the story, Bluebeard, points towards the willingness to disobey or betray the trust of a seemingly benevolent figure. For this argument, I would like to draw on Mary Douglas's book, Purity and Danger, where she explores concepts related to dirt and the sacred as inherently connected to the religious understanding of women as naturally sinful or corrupted beings. Douglas argues that the sacred needs to be continuously hedged with prohibitions. Relations with it are bound to be expressed by rituals of separation and demarcation and by beliefs in the danger of crossing forbidden boundaries. Hence, the very crossing of boundaries in biblical allusions brings forth the story of the fall, where Eve is tempted by the serpent into eating from the tree of knowledge after being explicitly told not to do so by God. Thus, what makes the tree of knowledge, or the knowledge of the sacred, so enticing is the fact that it is marked by prohibition. Nonetheless, God's warning against eating from the tree of knowledge is somewhat misleading. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die. In this, God presents the tree of knowledge as deadly, which it is, but not in a literal way where Adam and Eve would die upon eating from it, as if it were poisonous. Rather, God's wrath upon seeing his creatures transgress his command would bring the punishment of mortality. It is not the apple that makes Adam and Eve mortal. It is God's anger. Similarly, Bluebeard's warning is not in vain. He is aware that his wife will succumb to the temptation of opening the bloody chamber, but the purpose of his prohibition relies on the foretelling of her death caused by his wrath upon her knowing his secret, not in the transgression itself. Thus, even if Bluebeard is understood through a biblical lens, it is not a story about transgression, rather about the consequences of acquiring knowledge that threatens the authority or omnipotence of the dominant figure of the tale, whether it is God or Bluebeard himself. Now that the themes of transgression and its biblical origin have been addressed, the rejection of curiosity through interpretations of Bluebeard can be better understood. This demonization of curiosity takes form in Perrault's first moral at the end of the text, where he states, quote, "Curiosity, in spite of its many charms, can bring with it serious regrets. You see it 1,000 examples of it every day. Women succumb, but it's a fleeting pleasure. As soon as you satisfy it, it ceases to be. And it always proves very, very costly," end quote. By literally expressing that the matter to be learned from the tale is that the consequences of being curious are unspeakable horrors, Perrault positions the protagonist in the same context as Eve, as a transgressor who should have repented for her wrongdoing. I firmly believe that Perrault's Bluebeard can be read in ways that steer extremely far away from the supposed moral, since the curiosity of the protagonist is what furthers her knowledge of her otherwise concealed husband, particularly his crimes. Early in the tale, the narrator states that one of the factors that made Bluebeard undesirable was the hidden nature of his past and the unknown fate of his previous wives. What added more to the sense of disgust was that he had already married several women and no one knew what had become of them. Thus, by transgressing the mock prohibition established by Bluebeard, his wife confirms the unnerving assumptions of Bluebeard's character, possibly protecting other women from facing death, which would have been unavoidable if she had not been curious. Furthermore, Perrault characterizes Bluebeard's wife as tormented by her curiosity, which draws her even closer to the figure of Eve. Yet, Angela Carter's translation and reimagining of the tale in The Bloody Chamber positions the original story as an invitation to knowledge, which requires good interpretative skills when understanding Bluebeard's character and why the protagonist accepts his proposal. Bluebeard's physical traits, his Bluebeard, are already indicators of perversity, but the act of transgression is necessary to unveil his character fully. Carter explores this notion beyond the scope of the original tale in The Bloody Chamber, where the heroine's curiosity is more nuanced and based on contemporary discussions of marriage and power imbalances. Carter also refers to Bluebeard as the Marquis, which is an equally impersonal name as the one in the original tale. In The Bloody Chamber, the Marquis's wife seeks to know him. She's not only driven by a blind curiosity, but by a need to know what hides within her husband, which is what prompts her to enter the Bloody Chamber. If I had found some traces of his heart in a file marked personal, perhaps here, in his subterranean privacy, I might find a little of his soul. Throughout the tale, Carter makes various allusions to secrecy and concealment by referring to marriage as an unguessable country. An example of this is the metaphor of the Marquis's face, resembling a mask that only falls when he consummates his marriage with the protagonist and at the very end of the tale. And sometimes that face, in stillness, seemed to me like a mask, as if his real face lay underneath. Now, returning to the aforementioned point of Bluebeard not being a story about transgression, but about the thread of knowledge, it is evident that the acquisition of knowledge by the protagonist in The Bloody Chamber is ultimately rewarding in two ways. One, she is finally able to see the Marquis behind the mask, and two, he is defeated and the victims are avenged. Despite the initial prospect of punishment and the visceral possibility of torture, once again, curiosity and transgression are proven to be means of defiance against authority and will eventually benefit the transgressor, therefore questioning the validity of Perrault's initial moral in its entirety. Lastly, the importance of the key and the tarnishing of it is one of the fundamental aspects in understanding the link between temptation and transgression. As aforementioned, the biblical book of Genesis presents the sacred, knowledge, as something surrounded and encompassed by prohibition. God gives Adam and Eve the entirety of Eden to feast from, except for the tree of knowledge. And it is through exception and prohibition that curiosity grows. Thus, posing the question of why God has placed the tree of knowledge in Eden if he knew that Adam and Eve would eventually succumb to sin. Is this test of loyalty or faith an artificial prohibition that allows for the punishment of the transgressor for eating from temptation, which was served to them on a silver platter? These ideas drive my analysis of Bluebeard as a tale not about caution with curiosity and temptation, but about a desire from a supreme or more powerful being for the forbidden to be transgressed. Bluebeard's figure, then, can be associated with that of God, all-seeing and all-powerful in both Perrault and Carter's versions, a force that is only defeated by the trespassing of those weaker and smaller than him. Bluebeard, just like God, wants his secret to be found out. This is exemplified by Carter's protagonist towards the end of the tale. I knew I had behaved exactly according to his desires. Had he not bought me so that I could do this? I had been tricked into my own betrayal. I must pay the price for my new knowledge. In Perrault's version, the idea of temptation as a foreign and almost attached force is more present, yet Carter explores the insinuation that the Marquis, and hence Bluebeard, wanted his wife to betray him, to succumb to an artificial temptation created for his own gratification and pleasure. In both versions of the tale, the desire for prohibition to be transgressed is depicted clearly in the passage where Bluebeard hands over the keys to his wife. In Perrault's tale, there is a sense of false honesty, where Bluebeard gives his wife the keys to everything in his possession and instructs her, open anything you want, go anywhere you wish, yet forbids her from entering the bloody chamber, for there will be no limit to my anger, which mirrors the aforementioned biblical story of the fall. That being said, the false honesty or test for loyalty is more overtly expressed in Carter's version, since the Marquis' childlike treatment of the protagonist creates a very straightforward metaphor for temptation. He dangled the key tantalizingly above my head, out of my straining fingers, those bare red lips of his cracked slide long in a smile. He left it on a ring and shook it musically. The Marquise knows that she will succumb to this artificially crafted temptation, which is why the key is on the key ring in the first place. The fall into temptation from both protagonists is not one related to virtue being lost, but rather knowledge and maturity being acquired. Returning to Douglas's argument, dirt, or in the case of the protagonists, the tarnishing of their character, is viewed as disorderly. It is something subjective that can only be understood through a pre-existing hierarchy that is being threatened by the presence of such dirt or disorder. Hence, despite the prohibitions knowledge is hedged with, the transgression does not threaten its sacrality, but instead it threatens the power of authority in the stories. Perrault's moral at the end of Bluebeard has certainly incurred in the development of misogynistic readings of the tale as one about women's inherent state of sin and propensity to fall into temptation. Nevertheless, the story itself disproves this very moral. Curiosity is framed not as a sinful endeavor, but one of transgression and liberation that ultimately puts an end to a reign of terror. Similarly, in Carter's version, the violation of prohibition brings forth the long-awaited knowledge about her husband's real self that the protagonist has sought since the beginning of the tale. In both renditions, the acquisition of knowledge results in justice and freedom, as well as happiness for the protagonists. Thus, the warning against curiosity falls through. The biblical allusions present in the story can prompt a reading regarding threatening authority, whether divine or social, from a position of defiance towards prohibitions in regard to knowledge or the sacred. The pursuit of knowledge through transgression is the driving force behind the longevity of the tale. The willingness to become tarnished by knowledge in order to obtain clarity or liberation, to stand face to face with an omnipotent and all-knowing figure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maia. Our third speaker this afternoon is Cassandra Sarah Pegg, who is a fourth-year honors English literature and psychology student here at Concordia. She is fascinated by women writers of the 19th century and more generally by the 3 Fs. Can you guess? Folklore, fantasy, and feminism. When time permits between stressing over school, nobody else does that, and being one half of the Crab Apple literary team, Cassandra writes her feelings into short stories in the occasional bizarre poem. Cassandra.
Thank you. So I'll be reading my essay on the path to knighthood, the agency of the entourage in The Tale of Sir Gareth of Orkney. In many ways, the tale of Sir Gareth of Orkney is the quintessential knight's tale. Indeed, it reads almost as a fable, following this young man as he rises, semi-rags-to-riches style, from his self-imposed laboring to his true princely title. Male agency, and specifically knight agency, is in many ways the backbone and force behind Sir Thomas Malory's tales of chivalric prowess in Le Morte d'Arthur. In this way, it can appear that women and non-knights are consistently shoved into passive roles wherein they do not have willpower of their own, or at least their willpower pales in comparison to that of the knights, as it does in tales centering the knight Gawain or King Arthur himself. In Gareth's tale, however, this is not the case. In fact, Gareth's entourage is active and crucial in the bettering of Gareth as a knight and in the achievement of his chivalric pinnacle. Gareth is surrounded by active characters who push him to knightly valor in ways he could not achieve alone. These characters include Lionette, Lioness, and the dwarf, as much as Lancelot and even Gawain. Though women in this tale do continue to operate as damsels in distress, and the dwarf remains a subordinate comic relief to Gareth's seriousness, these characters exact their own agency on Gareth's quest and change his trajectory, just as the powerful knights Lancelot and Gawain do as well. Gareth's quest does not happen or progress in isolation, and he needs the people surrounding him to enforce their will on him in order to achieve true honor. Lionette occupies the primary position of bettering Gareth as a knight. Janet Jesmock emphasizes the importance of female characters like Lionette in the Morte, who will teach their knights in adventure and instruct them in earthly and heavenly chivalry. Indeed, Lionette immediately assumes a mocking and diminishing demeanor, which she keeps up for much of Gareth's adventure, and which teaches him the values of chivalry that she assumes he doesn't have. She dismisses him as a kitchen knave, and it is up to Gareth to take the lesson she is harshly giving and not fail as the knight at her side. Dorsey Armstrong points out that opportunities for knightly career building swirl around the locus of women's bodies, needs, and desires, clustering most thickly around single ladies, like lionette and lioness. Armstrong adds that the subjugated female is critical in the formation and maintenance of knightly identity. But Gareth's tale suggests that this formation need not occur with a strictly subjugated female. A woman's agency, when directed towards the creation of a knight, is deeply effective. Lionette, with her vicious rebukes of Gareth's every action, "What art thou but a LUCC and a turner of brooches and a ladle washer? All that ever thou dost is by misadventure and not by prayers of thy hands," does not seem to fit so neatly into the box of the subjugated woman. She exerts her agency over Gareth to get what she wants, the rescue of her sister, which would not happen if she occupied a meek, inferior role and did not speak against this man, this unproven knight. Armstrong explains, despite her constant harassment, or indeed because of it, Gareth works hard to adhere to the highest standard of knightly behavior, so as to achieve the greatest honor. As such, if Lionette had succumbed to the subjugated role of simply being a damsel in distress, and either chose to believe in him from the start, or, as Armstrong suggests, stopped berating him after his first victory, Gareth might not have met each knightly challenge with such eagerness, as he would have lost the motivation that a single woman provides for the completion of great feats, and thus the accumulation of honor. In fact, Lionette is also physically leading Gareth down the path of greatness, since she leaves and he rides after the damsel to catch up to her, thus beginning the quest on her terms. Lionette uses the threat of shame to egg Gareth on, which further highlights how her agency, in this case, is exercised through words. In this case, exercised through words, forces Gareth to continue seeking chivalric exaltation. She does not accept the Green Knight's praise of Gareth and insists that it is shame for the Green Knight to say him such worship. She denies other people's support of Gareth, insisting on his lack of honor. It is clear that Gareth does realize that she is actually helping him when he says he would be worse than a fool to depart from her all the while that he wins worship. Worship is something to be earned, and Lionette will not hand it to himself or let others do so until Gareth truly becomes the knight he is meant to be. Furthermore, Lionette saves Gareth from accruing shame each time he asks her if he should kill the knight he has defeated. As far as the Pentecostal oath goes, upon pain of forfeiture of their worship forevermore, knights must always give mercy unto him that asketh mercy. And, as is established by the Red Knight's Confession, a knight may be forced to do passing ill and shamefully while fulfilling a lady's request, which he cannot refuse. Thus, if Lionette so wished it, she could bring great shame to Gareth, since he would carry out her demands to give mercy or slay the knights he defeats. She chooses to allow him honor and acts mercifully each time. Therefore, her actions and words directly project Gareth down the path to ideal chivalry. Gareth's focus on one single woman quickly shifts to another when he arrives at Lioness's besieged castle and sees the lady herself in a window. Lioness, even more so than Lionette, takes on the role of the single woman who evokes great deeds in knights, and this whole quest is about saving her from the Red Knight. Furthering this posturing of the idealized woman figure to inspire the knight, Gareth immediately declares that he loves her and will rescue her, or else to die therefore. But Lioness is not entirely without agency. Though all she can really do during the battle with the Red Knight is cry, when the battle is done, and she and Gareth have become committed to each other, she sends him away to labor in worship for a year. Just like her sister, she does not want Gareth to settle. She also exalts him in honor by having the dwarf reveal Gareth's origins to herself and her siblings, forcing his kingly identity to the surface. In revealing his identity, she secures him the ultimate prize for a worshipful knight, marriage. Now that they know he comes from an exceedingly good family, she can marry him. Still, before marriage, there is one perilous trap within which a good knight may lose honor, the temptations of premarital sex. Though Lioness replaces Lionette as the single woman through which one can accrue honor, Lionette continues to preserve Gareth's honor by preventing him from succumbing to a shame that is difficult to resist. Lionette and Gareth burn both in hot love and are inclined to abate their lusts secretly. Luckily for them, this is not a well-kept secret. Though Lionette acts to protect her sister's honor and virtue more so than Gareth, her decision to use her subtle crafts to dissuade a premarital relationship ensures that his worship remains intact. Chastity will become crucial in the Sangreal quest, as the success of the Grail Knights is due to their chastity, which comes under a new emphasis in that tale. That which exalts those knights will also exalt Gareth, or at least prevent him from a fall from worship, and allow him to reach the pinnacle of knightly prowess without any missteps along the way. Some of Gareth's betterment comes from another unlikely source, his dwarf. At the tournament, his dwarf, who has thus far operated as a passive force, exerts his agency in a very important way when he keeps Gareth's ring. The dwarf is glad the ring was from Gareth, and then he wist well he should be known. Gareth's identity, which has been concealed throughout the whole tale by his pseudonym Beaumais, is concealed once again during the tournament by Lioness's ring, thus preventing Gareth from gaining the recognition he is due for his exceptional capabilities. Emily Rebecca Huber explains that the dwarf's actions establish Gareth's fame, as his identity is proclaimed loud and clear by the heralds when he is no longer concealed by the ring. In this final maturing process, Gareth is given his own identity as a knight, as is reflected in the fact that he becomes a knight associated with a color, yellow, like the great knights he defeats and recruits as his retinue. The hero takes his place among the greats when his name is proclaimed to Arthur's court, and he becomes reunited with his rightful community. The dwarf precipitates the unveiling of the hero, and thus cements Gareth's pinnacle of worship. These characters, Lionette, Lioness, and the dwarf, are responsible for much of Gareth's betterment as a knight, but Gareth is also pushed towards greatness by two of his own kind, Lancelot and Gawain. Lancelot vouches for Gareth from the beginning and tells Sir Kay to stop mocking he who Lancelot believes will prove a man of great worship. It is no wonder, then, that Lancelot takes an interest in him from the beginning and is himself the precise starting point of Gareth's life as a knight. Lancelot challenging Gareth to a duel tests his mettle and gives him an opportunity to prove himself worthy of the title and the honor that is inherent within it. Lancelot then gives him the Order of Knighthood, allowing him to begin achieving worship in the name of chivalry. Gareth fighting Sir Kay does not result in the same caliber of exaltation. It is truly the interest of his surrogate father, Arthur's best knight, that catapults the young, unknown Gareth along his path to greatness. There is one other knight, Sir Gawain, whose actions send Gareth towards honor and away from shame, though not in the same manner as his other companions. When he knights Gareth, Lancelot has just come back from many virtuous and honorable victories, and thus holds the greatest name of any knight of the world. Gawain, on the other hand, in Gareth's eyes, is ever vengeable, and where he hated, he would be avenged with murder, and that hated Sir Gareth. Gareth withdrew himself from his brother Sir Gawain's fellowship, and separates himself from the shameful dishonor that would come from following his blood relations as they murder and scheme. Instead, Gareth takes up fellowship with the exalted Lancelot, and there is no other knight whom Gareth loved so well. Gawain's insistence on actions of murder and vengeance Gawain's insistence on actions of murder and vengeance taking, which puts blood ties over chivalry and worship, influences Gareth to place himself securely in the company of Lancelot. Though this does not end well for him, his reputation is secured as honorable and not treacherous like Gawain's. While Gareth insists on creating an identity for himself without relying on his blood ties, his rise to prominence as a great knight does indeed rely on the people around him. Gareth is, without a doubt, powerful and capable, as all knights of his lineage must be. Still, it is through the agency of the women, Lionette and Lioness, his dwarf, and the two knights, Lancelot and Gawain, that he actually ascends to the pinnacle of knightly honor without losing his way in the process. In their own ways, each one of these characters pushes him to be the best he can be, and, with the exception of Gawain, expects excellence from him. Though male agency plays the central part in chivalry, Mallory's knights often make the wrong choices, and this tale, as in other tales in Le Morte d'Arthur, it is the knight's social sphere that guides them, inspires them to maintain their Pentecostal promises, and exalts them in their adventures. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Cassandra, and to all three of our presenters. So I think I will open up the floor for questions. I have some of my own, but I think I will at least initially cede the floor. Okay, so.
Hi. I have a question for Maya. Um, can you clarify a little bit how transgressional curiosity is a virtue if who you're transgressing against is kind of omniscient and they know exactly what you're up to?
Yeah. So part of my argument was very much centered around the Bible. So the idea that the original sin, like the original transgression that happened, was kind of like put there to be transgressed by God. So even though there's like an act of doing something that you're not supposed to be doing, this figure is so powerful and so all-knowing that they're aware that you're going to do it. So it's kind of like a mock prohibition that is set in place. So there's a need for transgression in order to achieve knowledge and mortality. And when looking at it from the perspective of the Bible, like in order for humanity to exist outside of Eden, there was a need for that transgression. So same thing in Bluebeard, like in order for the story to actually change, for other women to be saved, for like, you know, the fairy tale to kind of have a happy ending, there's a need for that transgression that has been placed by Bluebeard despite him knowing that it's going to be broken. So that's kind of what I was thinking. I don't know if that was kind of repetitive.
It's kind of like a necessary evil, maybe?
Yeah, more like a necessary evil. I use the word virtue throughout this like essay more so because it relates to the idea of the virtuous woman. So kind of like posing that parallel between curiosity as a sin and instead a virtue that will lead to good ultimately. So,
Thanks.
yeah.
Were there any other questions in the audience?
This is a question for Cassandra and Teomi, and congratulations everyone on your wonderful papers. I guess I'm just struck by a possible conversation between the two of them that I just wondered what you thought about it. You know, in this wonderful reading of Don Quixote and how, you know, this sort of inverse relationship between delusion and fiction and chivalric romance and the protocols of being a knight and depression, you know, that without that sort of fantasy, which gives him agency and a sense of place in the world, then he falls apart. That there's this sort of sense of needing that sort of chivalric code to make sense of himself and to feel a sense of agency in the world, even though, like, you know, the last thing Don Quixote has in the first half of Don Quixote is like real agency in the world. And an interesting parallel to Gareth, who, you know, with his entourage is so dependent on all of these others. And if chivalric masculinity is supposed to be about like I'm a knight pricking upon a plain and like I'm all by myself and I can do what I have to do, but then on the other hand, so dependent on everybody else constantly telling you the rules and what to do, this I don't know, just like I feel like between the two of your papers, there's a sort of comment, I suppose, on this sort of martial, heroic, masculine virtue and agency being a fantasy. And I guess I just wondered what both of you thought about that that conversation between your papers.
Yeah, I think when I was editing this paper, there's a big part about metafiction. I kind of had to cut and dwindle out just due to page space, but the first part that was published was like a almost satire of these older chivalric romances, which were written in that found document style, and so it was originally like a supposed to be comedic and like a satire of those ones, whereas I'm understanding from the essay that yours was a true writing of a chivalric tale, or a truer version. If Mallory's to be trusted. Okay, true. Well, this one is very candidly supposed to be like a satire, so I think it's interesting that like in the beginning, all of his attempts at agency through this are through the lens of satire, while Cassandra's, or the piece you're working with, is not like that. And by the end, My reading of the ending of Don Quixote isn't exactly what I'd seen while I was doing research for this paper. But yeah, I found it interesting that it wasn't only the people around the character that affected his self-image and his ability to have agency, or to believe that it wasn't, sorry, I'm trying to find my words. It wasn't only about the community that surrounded him that gave him confidence in the fact that he was a knight errant. It was also like his self-image of himself, which my reading of the ending is more of a reflection of Cervantes' own journey through that same thing that he ended up projecting onto his character. Yeah. Sorry, I'm having a hard time with your words, but I do agree that there's a good conversation between these two papers.
I was just going to talk a little bit about the idea of the male chivalric role being a fiction, like based on the fact that it's incredibly like driven by the people around them, especially the women. I was immediately thinking about Lancelot, whose entire thing is that he puts Guinevere over God. So like what his driving force is a woman, and like he will go to the ends of the earth for her. So I definitely think when you go into reading like Arthurian legends, there's a sense that you're definitely going to be falling into something that's like super sexist and like male oriented and male like power and whatever being the most important thing, but it's like critical to the Pentecostal oath that you respect a woman's that the woman's, I forget exactly the wording, but that you're not allowed to like do harm to any woman, and that like there is that like sexist sense of like that you can win this woman and everything, but there's an overarching theme of like all of these tales, and the progression of being a knight is necessarily defined by especially the women around them. So it definitely is a fiction, like Gareth's prowess and everything, and he makes it into a fiction where he like pretends to be a kitchen knave and is like, you know, put me onto this quest and I'll prove myself. I think like fiction and like male agency are like necessarily entwined. So there's definitely a connection between the two. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, I see one here.
The Engelbert Humperdinck microphone. I've been thinking about the Don Quixote, where part one is, like you're saying, a kind of satirical novel, a satire at the expense of the chivalric tradition. And the second part, partly from your description of it, of course, turns it into like the first postmodern novel in which is satirized, in a sense, the attempt to find a realistic correction to the chivalric conceits. But that shifts me also to Maia's talk, because we have something similar going on. We have the Perrault version of the oral tale of Bas Bleu, and then you have Carter translating it or rewriting it. I know you used the phrase 2 times, so I thought maybe I'll direct the question, the first it's maybe to Maia in this instance, because you've emphasized the continuities between them. But of course, as in the case of Don Quixote, there's this tremendous discontinuity. There's a different version of the story that's wandering around the apocryphal story, and these hilarious confrontations between the false and the true, and what does that mean in the realm of fiction at all? And in the case of the Perrault rewriting, you have the sense also of the discrepancies, the sense that, okay, here's the tale, and now I'm going to revive it, call the character the Marquis. Of course, Carter wrote a book about the Marquis de Sade, and so it's a very clear and explicit allusion to that particular Marquis. So I wanted to ask then, in the first instance, what do you make of the discrepancies between the Perrault and the Carter adaptations of the original tale, as it runs within this kind of continuity of storytelling, as in Quixote?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting to look at it because I had to read both for like my first semester of university like 2 years ago, and I remember thinking like there's no point of connection between these two versions whatsoever, just because Carter's version is definitely dealing more with like contemporary anxieties relating to marriage and the position of women in society, and there's like a whole discussion to be had about class regarding that story. But I feel like where like these two like versions of the tale meet for me, like more importantly than just the fact that they're based off the same original tale, is in the consequences of the transgression that I was talking about earlier. Like the idea that in both stories there's like a somewhat happy ending as a consequence to the betrayal of trust of this greater figure. And that's what stood out to me the most, because in Perrault's version we have this unnamed protagonist. We don't really know anything about her. We just know that her mother needs to marry her off somehow, and that she has brothers that will save the day at the end, and everything will be happy. And I feel like in Carter's version, the ending is also a little bit crazy, if I may say that. It's just like kind of out of place for me in the tale, but I feel like the main point of encounter between those two tales is how the transgression occurs and the consequences of the transgression, and how it's like so immediate and so like intense, and how the tale's like longevity is related to that. I think the fact that we're still telling the story of Bluebeard is related to that transgression, because there's like the inherent like human urge, I would say, to transgress the things that are forbidden to us. So that's what I think. I don't know if you want to say anything about Don Quixote.
Yeah, I think my, in terms of my essay, I think I was trying to say this earlier, but my wording was not quite right. But the ending, some people have also read the ending as satirical, the way Don Quixote has this revelation and he's like, all chivalric romances be damned. And some people are, I guess most people read that as satirical, where it's Cervantes doing it again, but now removing the possibility of any more apocryphal sequels coming out afterwards. But I read that ending as Cervantes' like disdain being projected through the character's death and through the character, and the whole meta-fictional layer of it, where it's not only the character going through this disillusionment because of the transformative power stories within the narrative, it's also Cervantes going through that same process outside of it, and they converge at the end. And Convergences, but yeah, it was really interesting to look at that, how it's not like these two completely separate works. It's within the same one, but they're both, the nature of them is so different, and one is so affected by the other, but also affected by what's happening outside of the novel. And I thought that was a really interesting aspect to look at. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Last call.
I'll ask a question to everyone. I'm wondering what your first contact with your text was and how that relates to your main agreement. It's like transgression and virtue, chivalry and the entourage and reality fiction as a writer.
Well, I read Don Quixote in class. I'm in liberal arts, and we do that, and we talked a lot about the metafictional aspect of it, and that was always fascinated me, when media, like characters break the fourth wall, or like it's affected by something on the outside, and it was done to such an extreme in Cervantes, like took this to such an extreme in Don Quixote, and I really wanted to explore that more, because I could see how it affected, like the tone in part 2 was completely different, and the whole process of disillusionment was fascinating. The fact that it came not only from the character's experience in the novel, but also the author's experience. Like, I thought that was a really cool layer to explore.
I guess we all took a class on the thing that we're writing about, but I took a class on Arthurian literature. a couple semesters ago, and it just seems that every tale, a bit like we talked about before, every tale has to do with agency versus the knight's agency versus everyone else's agency upon them. And Gareth was my favorite of all of them, so I felt the need to write an essay about him. So yeah.
This was also through class, as I just said, 260. And the first time that I read the texts, it was very much like an English introductory class, and I very much like disregarded them in this bulk of like just fairy tales that I had to read my first semester and had to reread them for another class last semester. And that's where the themes of like the extreme like moralistic teachings of a lot of fairy tales kind of like came to light, especially in relationship to religion and to the role of women in both religion and fiction and how they're so like inherently connected. And I think that's what like made me want to write about it more, like the fact that I had already had an interaction with this text before, and like 2 years later having to read them again in a completely different context where I could like pinpoint where these like once again like intertwined with one another was what like prompted the whole discussion about like virtue, transgression, etc., etc. So
Do we have time for another question, Louise and Emily? Yes, okay. I will ask a question of all three, and this is a history professor question, which you're all quaking perhaps in your chairs at this point. One of the things, of course, we as historians think about is, is the context in which writers write and for whom they are writing. And I wondered, and so I'm asking you this knowing that it may be a somewhat unfair question, and you can, just deflect and answer a different question if you prefer. That's how you do it at a conference. And by the way, if you don't like the question, you just answer a different one. So what do you know or think about the specific historical context in which these writers write? And for Maia, you get the choice, I think, of talking about either of your authors. But, what is in the 15th century kind of context do you think? Like, what do you think Mallory is thinking about his audience? I mean, the interesting thing for me about the Bluebeard tale is that it was theoretically based on a true story, which is very different from the one in the fairy tale. And I'm actually teaching about it tomorrow, very coincidentally. And so, and it's about a serial murderer of boys. So it's actually really a strange transition to make it to be about women instead of boys. But I don't know how much people knew about that when Perrault was writing, actually. Anyway, so that's a digression. But, thinking about what it is that people are meaning, in a sense, you think that the author is meaning to take from it. And then similarly for Teomi, what do you think, the 17th century reader of Cervantes is, what do they have in their minds about what a chivalric romance is and, what he's doing with that? Okay.
If you had asked me about this a year ago, I would have had a lot more answers, because that's when I read this, and that's when I was taught it. But at the time, I know that there's a lot of references in the novel to the political things that were happening in Spain at the time, like the I don't know. I'm not a good history person with the terms, but there was a lot of stereotypes about Arabs back then. So the whole scribe being Moor brought on this whole other layer of, can we even trust this story? Can we not? And of course, it was supposed to be written as a satire, so readers obviously read it as such. And it, but then I was taught that this was the first proper novel written, and in the way that it had like a beginning, a plot, an end, and it was all put together as one, and people were like, a chapter would come out at a time and people would wait for the next chapter as the first like really widely read novel of this sort. And so people were just like engrossed by it and would devour chapters as they came out. And it was this like cultural, this huge cultural moment when these chapters were coming out, and that's why it took on such another life afterwards, where people actually were coming up pretending to be Don Quixote in real life. There's between fiction and reality, there's major like overlays if you look at the history of the actual novel, but it was a whole like Excalibur moment where it was like, I'm Don Quixote, no, I'm Don Quixote. Everyone was trying to claim that they were the real Don Quixote, and it was a big phenomenon in Spain at the time. So yeah, I think that's also why Cervantes wanted to reclaim his authorship afterwards, was to say, all of these ideas, they're mine and they're fictional. And yeah, kind of like no one could have expected that was going to happen when he wrote a satirical story about an aspiring knight errant.
I'm going to echo what you said, and if this question was asked when I wrote this essay, answer would be great, so I'm going to do my best. But I think like Sir Thomas Malory and Geoffrey of Monmouth have Monmouth, I always mispronounce that, have like a similar reason, I guess, for writing or whatever, that it seems to be to give this like quasi-historical, like this is how, I'm going to say England, even though it's, anyways, geography and history, not my forte, like that England is, this is like the golden age. And that was like a lot of what had to do with like Arthurian legend, was that this was like the golden age, and now we've fallen from this golden age, and there's no going back. And I think that that's a lot of what comes from Le Morte d'Arthur as well, is just a sense that like this is the quintessential, like what men were quintessentially supposed to be and how they're supposed to act, and the Pentecostal oath is how they're supposed to act. And it kind of like operates as like, we're talking about like fiction versus reality. It does kind of posit itself as if this is reality and this is history, but with a sense of like a history that's long past, that we can't go back to. So I think that's kind of the historical context of it, although I'm sure there's a much more in-depth answer out there.
Yeah, I was thinking about the historical context like a lot when I was writing this paper, particularly because if we look at Perrault's version, it's very much written for children. Like it's a fairy tale that's written for children, more particularly girls, just because of the moral at the end of the story. So at the end of the tale, you have like the big chunk of text that's like, see, husbands aren't so bad nowadays, but if you're curious, horrible things are going to happen to you. So I think it's interesting that the fairy tale itself was straightly directed towards young girls, as if there was like an intention to impose this kind of morality upon like more impressionable audiences, that I think is very different from the context that Carter writes her version in. It was very much like an era of like very big feminist movements throughout literature, and particularly with Carter writing such like sexual and sensual like reimaginings of fairy tales, I think is something that was like groundbreaking for the era, first of all, but also, once again, I feel like Carter's stories were directed towards women, because most of the characters are women. Most of the like internal conflicts that happen are very much like a reflection of a lot of like feminist discussions that were happening during the time regarding like marriage, virginity, pregnancy, like all of those kinds of things. So I think it's interesting to see how both were directed towards women, most likely from very different age groups when they were published. But I also think that if we like look at it a little bit through like reception theory, like Joss's reception theory, the fact that these tales are still incredibly relevant in the kind of tales that we're telling today just talks more to the fact that like these themes have always been a part of literature, and they will continue to be no matter how the audience shifts or changes. So I think that's like what I thought about the historical context. It's such a huge part of it. I wish I could say more about it, but same thing. Like, I learned about these like a while ago, so yeah.
Okay, thank you. So any other questions? Anybody else? All right. Well, I think I will then bring our panel to a close. Let's have a round of applause for all three. Yes, and the applause is very well merited. An excellent job from all three of you. Okay, so I bring this session to a close.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for coming into Forest Space today and activating this conversation. For all of you, those of you online and in the space, thank you for your questions and your contributions as well. We're going to be closing up the Zoom. Oh, sorry, no, we're going to be keeping the live going all day, but we are going to be taking a short break where we're going to have some nosh and play some tunes and hopefully have a great chat. So stick around for that if you're in the space. And for those of you online and those of you here, we will be back for our last panel at 4 o'clock. Sorry about that. At 4. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.